Tonight, join me for a little trip down memory lane, at least of the last year or so, when I'll be revisiting several of the books that we looked at in the last season, Jason and I. And I'll also be looking at some books that we didn't have a chance to get to, some new books, some old books, and all other kind of cool, creepy, and weird things. So thank you so much for joining me tonight on Mysterious Library. Welcome to Mysterious Library. I'm your host, Dr. Dean Bertram, and unfortunately, my co host, Jason McLean, is rather sick tonight, or I know he wouldn't have not been here because he loves nothing more than to venture down into the labyrinths of the library, as he tells you about every week, fight the goblins and the orcs and the trolls and all the other type of critters, to haul the books back to the surface for us to read from. And tonight there are a bunch of books. Before we get to all of them, though, I would just like to tell everybody I hope you had a wonderful Christmas, and I hope you're getting ready for the new year. I'm so grateful for how many of you have joined us this year and watched and listened to Jason and I chat about the world's weirdest books. But it's been a sad year as well. Just last month, we lost one of the most preeminent authors in the entire Fortean field. We actually discussed one of her books before she passed. That book, of course, is The Beast of Bray Road, and the author I'm speaking of is the great Linda Godfrey. Linda Godfrey is probably, perhaps the only person, certainly the only person I've ever met who coined the actual name of a cryptid. She is responsible for popularizing The Beast of Bray Road, both in that book, which I think was the early 2000s, as well as beforehand in her ongoing investigations when she was a journalist in the Elkhorn area, which ended up achieving national publicity on all types of news services. And as well, of course, it was later popularized in shows like Monster Quest by this network's own creator, Doug Hychek. Linda, of course, published and wrote a number of other books, The Michigan Dogman. More recently, I Know What I Saw. And perhaps the book which I first became a fan of was Weird Wisconsin. I read this book when I moved to this incredibly strange state. I found that in some kind of Paul Bunyan, I don't know, just like supper club or something down in Wisconsin Dells. And when I read that book, I became conscious of how weird this state is. There were tales of the Beast of Bray Road, the Hodag, killer midgets at Haunchyville, weird UFO landing ports, all kinds of just strangeness. And as somebody who ran film festivals for years in Sydney, Australia, this idea started to kind of niggle away at me. You should do a film festival in Wisconsin and just about all things weird. So I didn't just have to do genre like I was used to in Australia, horror and science fiction and fantasy, although I still programmed those, but strange documentaries and all manner of weirdness. And it was because of Linda's book that I ended up launching Midwest Weird Fest. And I had an incredible, just great joy of being able to world premiere her feature documentary. And the first film she ever made, Return to Wildcat Mountain, her and her son made it. And they both came to the festival a few years ago. And I got to meet her in person. And she was just a wonderful lady. I mean, she was so meek and mild and polite on the surface, but she was just a giant of the field, as anybody who's read her books or knows of her is aware. So it's probably a good time of the year, perhaps, to think about Linda and realize her commitment and her importance to the field that we're all interested in, and perhaps read some of her books. They're all wonderful. Speaking of some other books that we never normally talk about on Mysterious Library, and the reason we don't talk about them is because my co-host wrote them, and they are How UFOs and Bigfoot Prove the Bible is True, and Metroplex Monsters. Metroplex Monsters deals with all the strange cryptid phenomena around the Dallas-Fort Worth area, and they're both fantastic books by Jason McLean. So if you watch this show every week and you haven't read any of Jason's books, he has others as well. They're all on his Amazon author page, I believe, but these might be the two which are of most interest to regular viewers and listeners of Mysterious Library. I used to, in fact, that's how I first met Jason. I had him on the other show that I host, Talking Weird, previously to doing Mysterious Library, previous to us moving to the Untold radio network. And when I had him on to discuss Metroplex Monsters, still feel bad. I kept referring to it as Megaplex Monsters because I'm so used to Cineplexes in Australia, which are called Megaplexes. And I never used the term Metroplex before. So apologies, Jason, for that time that I had you on Talking Weird. And I kept miffing the name of your book. Oh, crikey, that was it was embarrassing when I look back on it. Anyway, I know so many people who tune in to the Untold Radio Network are massive fans of cryptids and Bigfoot, and there was a couple of really significant Bigfoot books which I particularly enjoyed in 2022, and one of those is actually the book The Bigfoot Influences by Tim Halloran, and you can watch Tim's show, The Bigfoot Influences, on the Untold Radio Network, and the show, like the book, interviews the most important movers and shakers in the Bigfoot community, and I found it particularly interesting as somebody who is always been more on the outside of cryptid research. I'm interested in it, but I'm certainly not a participant, and as anybody who's a regular viewer or listener of Mysterious Library or of Talking Weird or has seen me anywhere else knows, I tend to favor a more supernatural or esoteric or social psychological interpretation of what some of these things are. And it fascinated me that in Bigfoot Influences, which is just loaded with every Bigfoot researcher you can almost think of, they had a similar question for each of them. Well, they had a similar number of questions, but one of them was, what do you think Bigfoot is? And almost every researcher in that book said something along the lines of it either being a relict hominid species or an undiscovered species of North American ape. There were only a couple of people. I think Les Stroud, interestingly, was one of them who suggested it might be something paraphysical, but it just went to show that the significance of or the importance of that flesh and blood interpretation within Bigfoot research. So yeah, it's a book which is definitely worth reading. And particularly if you're in Bigfoot and you want to have a great idea of what people are thinking about in the field, you should really check that out. Now, another awesome Bigfoot book, which we have covered on Mysterious Library, and I also interviewed the author a number of times, both about this book and previously, and that is Lyle Blackburn and his recent book, Texas Bigfoot. We tend to think of Bigfoot often as being something which haunts only the Pacific Northwest, and I know that seems the more plausible scenario usually. But as Lyle points out, there's more forest in the state of Texas than in any state of the Union except Alaska. So who knows? It's a fascinating book. All of Lyle's books are amazing. And this is definitely something anybody who has an interest in Bigfoot should certainly pick up and read and go back and revisit those shows. Go and watch the Lyle interview talking about that book on Talking Weird, which is available in the archives of the Untold Radio Network, which you can find either going to untoldradioam.com and checking out Talking Weird or just looking for it on the YouTube channel. And also, of course, Mysterious Library, the same when we only did that about a month or 2 ago, actually. There's another guest that I had just recently for the Christmas episode, actually, of Talking Weird, and we haven't done one of his books on Mysterious Library yet, and that's Chad Lewis, another native of the state of Wisconsin. Not that I'm a native, but I feel like it now that I live here in the Northwoods and I'm constantly surrounded by snow. And that's his book, Winter Legends and Lore. That is brand spanking new. In fact, Chad just shipped the first copies today. You can get it on his website, which I think is chadlewisresearch.com. You can also find it on Amazon. Go back and check out that episode as well. It's a great time of the year to listen to it. It's just last week's Talking Weird. And Chad just regaled me with all of these legends and strange tales about the things people used to believe in and partake on in Christmas. And I ordered the book straight away, but it hasn't, as I said, just shipped. So I don't have a copy yet. But I have several of other Chad's books, including another book from, I believe, 2022. And that's Lumberjack Creatures of the North Woods. And I actually went to see Chad when he spoke at my local library, and I'd already interviewed him on an old Talking Weird, and he very generously gave a copy of this book to my daughter, and it was a big favorite in this household. You can read about all those type of legendary creatures in this, neck of the woods, creatures like the hide behind, which have always fascinated me, which is meant to be so thin that it can hide behind itself, or it always hides behind you or behind thin trees, and it's responsible for all kinds of abductions and disappearances of lumberjacks, which brings to mind now tales like the David Paulides missing 411 accounts about weird disappearances. It also had a creature I was unaware of called the agropelter, but it almost rings like Bigfoot lore. These ape-like things that live in the trees and are known to throw things at people. So was that just a lumberjack legend, or was it based on something that may actually have been experienced? Who knows? But check out both of those books by Chad. He's got a bunch of other fantastic books as well. Now, the next book that I'm going to chat a little briefly about is a book I didn't discover until, or I didn't read at least until 2022. I believe it came out in 2021. It's gone through already, I think, a couple of different editions or reprintings, and that is Jacques Vallée's and Paola Harris's Trinity, the Best Kept Secret. Now, it's no secret to anybody who watches this show or Talking Weird that I am a big fan of Jacques Vallée. In fact, I'm such a fan of him, I named my barn cat after Vallée, because cats, or after Jacques Vallée. So my barn cat is called Vallée because the French are cool and cats are cool. And he just appeared mysteriously one night on my back porch, so it seemed fitting. Now, Jacques Vallée is probably the most important living thinker in the history of UFO belief. He might be the most important thinker ever in the history of UFO belief, at least as a theoretician. He's certainly up there with John Keel, who's my other favorite UFO writer. And I don't think you can read a book by Jacques Vallée which isn't just spectacular and mind-opening and so insightful. That is Until Trinity, the Best Kept Secret. And it's difficult to say anything bad about what Jacques done. I certainly noticed some people in the UFO community who should have known better seemed very reluctant to criticize this book. And it's, in fairness, I guess he is an elder statesman of ufology, but unlike most of his previous books, which were very suspicious of physical nuts and bolts interpretations of extraterrestrial crashes and extraterrestrial visitations, he always led to it being something other than that obviously physical type phenomenon. In fact, in one of his earlier books, I think it was Revelations, he talked about various fallacies that UFO authors and researchers fall for. And one of them was the lure of the physical. He used to be very dismissive of the Roswell UFO crash, for example, thinking there was nothing to it at all, and often saying that he didn't think the US government knew any more about UFOs really than what we do, or very little in addition. That all changed with this book. This book suggests that a Roswell type UFO crash happened before Roswell in 1945 outside the Trinity testing site in New Mexico, and that and that essentially the government had already recovered that saucer 2 years before Roswell. And I don't find any convincing evidence in that book, which is any more convincing than evidence about the Roswell crash. In fact, I think there's far more evidence for the Roswell crash, even though I'm suspicious of the traditional extraterrestrial narrative there anyway. But if you haven't read Trinity, it's worth checking out. I can't say I recommend it as an important book, but maybe Jacques knows something which isn't in that book. Maybe his gut instincts are so wonderful that he can trust witnesses that don't seem particularly, to me at least, reliable. But I hate to say something negative about that book. I've been meaning to do it for a long time and I haven't. So that's my first public, I suppose, position on how little I think of Trinity, the best kept secret. Now, a book I think very highly of that came out in 2022. And I pretty sure Jason, if he was here, would agree with me. It might be the most important book of 2022 in the paranormal field, and that is there's actually 3 books, although here's just a photo of the first 2 I took when I received them, although I have the 3rd volume, which is the companion volume with the appendices in it as well, and that's Joshua Cutchin's Ecology of Souls, A New Mythology of Death and the Paranormal. I interviewed Joshua about these books on Talking Weird a couple of months ago, and Jason and I discussed volume 1 at some length here on Mysterious Library. Essentially, Joshua is suggesting that there is something that links all paranormal phenomenon and UFO phenomenon, and that root thing which seems to link it all is death or the death experience. And there's probably nobody writing on the planet at the moment who does a better job of folkloric comparison in the Fortean field than Joshua. So he's very capable of making this argument, which he makes extensively with thousands of footnotes and just source after source after source, that there's something which parallels these various phenomena. I've said in the past, and I'll say again, I don't know if that's death. I think you could latch onto another interpretation and say that a lot of these different phenomena, as people have, Jacques Vallée for one, that things like UFO belief seem to parallel fairy faith, for example, or as another author we'll be getting to has mentioned in the past, that a lot of UFO and paranormal phenomena can be explained from a biblical perspective. And I know certainly that's Jason's perspective and one that I'm very sympathetic to as well. But that said, Ecology of Souls is probably, if I could only recommend one book that was published in 2022, or 3 books really, but it's essentially one across them, to go away and read for an incredible understanding of all types of different phenomena and how there are parallels between them. I can't recommend highly enough Ecology of Souls. Another book that I can't recommend highly enough, and probably something that you could use to fit in that place that death sits in the Ecology of Souls book, which is the central joining motif or the central joining phenomenon which links all the other phenomena. And that's the Gnostic or early Christian or Neoplatonic idea that this reality isn't real and there's a higher spiritual reality, and we've kind of sunk into this physical matter. The Matrix is very much a physical realization of that idea that we're trapped in a reality that isn't the base reality or the real reality. Elon Musk has made similar arguments recently, of course, but perhaps in modern times, post-Plato, post the early Gnostic Christians, the person who had the most interesting theory about this was Philip K. Dick, which he actually spoke about at some length in a number of the last novels he wrote before he passed, including Valis, which is one of my favorite novels of all time. Philip K. Dick suggested that we were trapped in a black iron prison and that the Roman Empire had never ended, that we were still stuck in that time period just with this overlaying veneer of a modern history. And he had his own strange religious or paranormal experiences, including a pink beam of light hitting him between the eyes, which he believed was some type of communication from a superior intelligence, which he termed at various times Valis or Zebra. And the exegesis goes into this in far more detail and at far more length. It's an edited version of just his I suppose, musings on this type of philosophy. And although you get it from those novels like Radio Free Albemarle and Valis and the like, it's worth reading Dick's original ideas. And I hadn't found this book until I was aware of it, but I hadn't read it until recently. For those of you, again, who watch the show regularly, you know that I did my PhD in UFO belief some time ago, and I kind of stopped reading about UFOs and all things paranormal from, I don't know, 2007 until relatively recent times. This book, I believe, came out in 2011, so I certainly would have read it if it had come out a little bit earlier when I was doing my dissertation, but I only discovered it now. A book that did come out towards the end of my time of doing my PhD research, and probably still, I would argue, one of the most important books about the UFO phenomenon ever written, is Greg Bishop's Project Beta, the story of Paul Benowitz, national security, and the creation of a modern UFO myth. I've had Greg Bishop on Talking Weird before we moved to the Untold radio network, and a couple of weeks ago, Jason and I here on Mysterious Library discussed a book based on a film rather based on that book and based on a couple of other books, and that film is Mirage Men. So essentially, it's the story of an electrical engineer who lived opposite Kirtland Air Force Base and essentially believed he was picking up potentially ET messages from that base and seeing UFOs. And when he took it to the base and told them, being the good patriot that Benowitz was, they realized he was actually looking at advanced US technology. And the AFOSI agent and who headed the case, Rick Doty, began this kind of campaign of trying to convince Benowitz that yes, what he was really seeing was extraterrestrial, and it spun out from there. And much of modern UFO belief, like underground bases and the Majestic 12 documents and secret treaties between extraterrestrials and the US government, come out of the Benowitz affair and some of the other stories around it. So Project Beta, I believe it came out in 2005, is an absolute must read. If you're not going to read it, see Mirage Man, because the author, Greg Bishop, was actually the main consultant on that and appears quite prominently in that film as well. And if you want to have any idea of how this whole type of X-Files UFO belief mythology really sunk its teeth into the modern UFO field, the book and the movie are a very good entryway to understanding some of that. Now, how I got into the UFO field, or how I became interested in it as an adult, is probably because of this book, the one on the left, Encounters by Edith Fiore. And recently, last year in 2021, but I didn't pick it up till this year, she did a very small book. I don't even think it's 100 pages, UFO Abductions, which kind of has some of her cases that she'd done since Encounters in it, I believe. In Encounters, which I think first came out in 1989, although I read it sometime after that, um, she essentially, as a psychologist, a psychotherapist, she essentially recounted many of the hypnoregression sessions that she'd done with various clients where she found out they'd been abducted by extraterrestrials. She even says in that book, many of them didn't have any idea they'd been abducted by extraterrestrials until they came and saw me. And she also admits that she read Donald Kehoe's Flying Saucers Are Real cover to cover in one day in the 1950s, and from then on in, she forever believed in the extraterrestrial hypothesis, i.e. that aliens were visiting this planet aboard flying saucers, and she used to sit outside watching the skies and the like. So you really have to question how much of a dog in this fight Edith Fiore had. I would suggest a lot, when she was playing around or doing hypnoregression with her patients and finding out they'd been abducted by extraterrestrials. Now, when I read that book, I was only in my 20s. I hadn't really thought about, anything ET related since I was a little boy, and probably saw movies like, ET the Extraterrestrial. But when I read the book, Edith Fiore obviously is very capable of drawing out memories, or perhaps some would argue implanting memories or encouraging memories to go a certain way. And in the book, she says very early on, while you're reading this, you might have strange memories or recollections of nightmares, or feel uncomfortable or feel a little scared. Your heart might beat a little faster. And if you do, essentially, she says, the long story short, that might mean you're an extraterrestrial abductee, an alien abductee. And of course, it's a scary book. As I've said before, if you read Stephen King's It and your heart starts beating faster, it doesn't mean you've been abducted by a clown to the sewers. It just means it's a scary book. And this book is filled with weird alien abduction, so it's quite scary. But what I found disturbing when I read the book was I remembered a dream I had had. I'd never forgotten it, but I hadn't thought a lot about it. And one of the things Edith Fiore says is, if you remember any strange dreams, I had a recurring dream when I was a young boy, I guess when I was about 5, that a little man came into my room and used to take me away. Now, just to qualify, that little man in no way looked like a gray extraterrestrial. As I've said before, he probably looked, if anything, more like the type of little person who suffers from proportional dwarfism. I haven't seen ever in real life, but I know as a kid I'd seen in films like The Wizard of Oz, or since then I would have seen in films like Todd Browning's Freaks. He also, on reflection, the little man, as I've always remembered him, reminds me of the little goblin-esque creature in Fuseli's Nightmare, which I'm putting on the screen now for those who are watching rather than listening. He was very goblin-esque. And I don't have a whole lot of memories of where I got taken to, but I know I got taken away. And again, I think this was all a dream, or was just my subconscious dealing with something. But one time I remember, the only time I remember ever being taken somewhere in this dream is didn't wake up. I was all of a sudden, and I can't remember how I got there. I was all of a sudden in this large room, I think with high ceilings, with the little man, and we were surrounded by very tall beings. And it's a very strange memory. I remember it still. When I was there in this dream, or this whatever it was, thinking one of the tall figures was my mother. I guess because when you're a kid, when you're at parties and the like, shopping, you always have this taller adult next to you, and you kind of pull on your mother's or your father's jeans or leg to get attention. And I thought one of these beings next to me was my mother, and I pulled on its leg, and then this thing bent down, and its face was, I don't know, several inches to a foot away from my face, and it wasn't my mother, and it was something that certainly wasn't human. Again, it didn't look like a gray extraterrestrial, and as I've said before, I don't like trying to describe what that thing looked like, because I think I've been so influenced by horror and science fiction movies over the years that I probably would have a tendency to fill this thing in. But it was scary. Now, again, I don't think I was abducted, but when I read Edith Fiore's book as, somebody in my 20s, I was like, maybe I was an abductee. And that's what launched my interest in reading more about UFO belief, and why I probably ended up doing it for my PhD, not to try to discover whether I was an abductee or not, because by the time I'd done my PhD or started my PhD, I didn't believe I was an abductee anymore. But because this was such a fascinating phenomenon, and I was conscious that maybe if I'd gone that route where I went to see somebody who did hypnoregression, or a therapist, who knows what additional memories would have been recalled or perhaps implanted. And it's interesting just to look back phenomenologically as well at those memories, at those dreams, because they seem very real. Particularly real is the very last time that the little man came to take me, where for some reason I knew if I went with him, I just felt it in my belly, in this dream state I was in, that I would never return. So I fought the little man, like I wrestled him on top of the bed. And I don't know if I beat him or not, but I certainly came to some kind of impasse, and the little man left and never came back to haunt my dreams or my sleep again. And what fascinates me about that story is it's as physically real, or in my memory, as similar dreams were I have as a child, of when I might have been like tussling with other boys in schoolyards or in sandpits. And that's what I think is interesting about this space between the real and the unreal. Whatever the reality is, I think, as people like Henry Corbin and Patrick Harper have suggested, there's an imaginal space which isn't entirely the other world, which isn't entirely our world, but when you enter it, it seems realer than our world. For example, I don't know, I guess if you were eating a pineapple in that world, it would taste juicier, and you'd remember its taste more than you remember any taste in this world. Or if you got in a fight with a little man, you'd remember it more than any fight in this world. Or if you saw a very bright light, it would be brighter than any light you ever saw in this world. So something's happening with the way we engage with the other. And it was reading Edith Fiore's book, which started to make the 20 something me question the reality around me, that made me become conscious, not that alien abductions are necessarily real or unreal, but that people who have these experiences, as I think I had to some degree, at least as in a dream state or an imaginal state, they can be terribly impactful. And you've got to be careful what you begin to believe if you've had that type of experience, or what you tell somebody who's had that type of experience, because I think there's a susceptibility to somebody who's undergone a very powerful imaginal experience. Now, speaking of the alien abduction phenomenon and speaking of ETs, here's another fascinating book that I missed when I was doing my PhD. It came out afterwards. I think it came out about, I don't know, 2010, 2011, or something like that. It certainly came out after I'd finished my dissertation and had been around a while before I found it recently. 2010, I think, is when that book was released. And I just love the artwork on it. It's Mac Tony's The Crypto Terrestrials, and the cover art is by Nadia Sabin. And if you look at that artwork, it's obviously kind of a riff on the famous cover of Communion by Whitley Strieber. But while the image on Communion, the alien on Communion, was so inhuman, it probably launched a million nightmares, and I'm sure had something to do with the popularity or the increasing cultural influence of the alien abduction tale. But the being on crypto terrestrials, it looks more like us. It looks more, in a way, human. And that's significant because the book by Mac Tonnies, and this was published posthumously. Mac Tonnies had died sometime shortly beforehand, which was very sad, as he was clearly quite a brilliant theoretician. But Tony suggested that whatever the supposedly extraterrestrial experience or phenomena or reality of it was, he believed that these things actually didn't come from a distant star system, but rather they'd been something that had coexisted with us for a very long time. In other words, something possibly like the Fae or the Fair Folk or the fairies. And that the most, I suppose, interesting part of the book is he suggests that maybe now they're intentionally masquerading as extraterrestrials because that's our cultural expectation. Now, other theoreticians, again, back to people like Jacques Vallée and John Keel, had suggested in the past, whatever we're dealing with at an extraterrestrial, at this kind of phenomenological level, it might appear as extraterrestrial, but it might just present itself to us the way we culturally expect it, or we perceive it the way we culturally expect it. Well, Tony's actually says maybe this thing looked different once and now it presents as extraterrestrial, which is pretty fascinating. Anyway, the crypto terrestrials is great. It's as I think Greg Bishop, who we talked about before, having written Project Beta, he writes an excellent afterword to that book, and he says people like Mac Tonnies are so important, as I would suggest people like Joshua Kutchiner, who we talked about before, because they throw out these theoretical ideas that help us to perhaps approach this phenomenon, these experiences, whatever they are, differently to just whatever the most popular interpretations are. And speaking about alternative interpretations, we about a month or two ago, I think maybe a month ago, on Mysterious Library, Jason and I talked about a book called Reversing Herman, also by Michael Heiser. And Heiser suggests that the biblical narrative is very clear that we used to be far more involved with these fallen angels, which, as Genesis 6:1-4 suggests, came down and bred with human women, and as a result, there was the offspring, the Nephilim, that then when they died, they became the demons of today. And while it's a definite Christian interpretation, it's not the standard Christian interpretation you're used to getting in the modern world because the churches, for the most part, ignore things like Genesis 6 1 to 4, or they downplay it, or they have a different interpretation. And apocryphal books like the Book of Enoch, which clearly is referencing Genesis 6 1 to 4, and clearly the people who were writing in the New Testament had been influenced by. Enoch's been all but forgotten, and that book goes into far more detail about the relationship with with our ancestors, with these other spiritual beings, this unseen realm, this other order of reality. And this again fits into some of the themes you can see are going through these books that I'm talking about, or through some of them, that maybe there's an explanation for non-human intelligences interacting with us. That is assuming that it is actually something beyond a psychological or social phenomenon, which I think there's a good case to be for a lot of it being like that as well. But I'm very sympathetic to ideas like Mike Heiser's, like Joshua Cutchin's, like Mac Tony's crypto-terrestrial. It's just a different way of looking at this type of phenomenon. So, moving on, here's a book that I should have, and you should read The Unseen Realm, by the way. You should read any of Heiser's stuff, whether you're a Christian or not, because he's not just some, I don't know, loose cannon making all these ridiculous claims. He's somebody who has an actual PhD in Semitic languages, and he's been writing and reading and thinking about this stuff forever. And the things he sources are actually academic source material where other academics have said the same thing. It just hasn't reached down to the popular consumption. So that's Mike Heiser's, I suppose, almost his mission or his real value is taking this kind of this study of ancient languages and ancient biblical texts and bringing down to us what scholars have been saying for a long time, but which have been ignored by the modern church. Now, I hadn't read this book, much to my shame, because I certainly was familiar with most of the UFO encyclopedias, as you have to be if you're writing a PhD on UFO belief, like Jerome Clark's once 3-volume series, then it became 2 volumes, then another 2 volumes. I own all 3 of those editions. And I also owned another earlier UFO encyclopedia by Ronald Story, which I think was published in 1980, and one by Margaret Sachs. And there are a bunch of them. I probably have, I don't know, 10 different UFO type encyclopedias on my bookshelf, or very close to that. This one, interestingly, there's an interesting backstory about it before we discuss the book. So it's the Encyclopedia of Extraterrestrial Encounters, edited by Ronald Story, and it dropped in, or was released in 2001. And apparently it was released very close to September 11. And so nobody was interested in really UFOs after that hideous day and that shocking attack. And it kind of just got lost. But it might be one of the best UFO encyclopedias ever written. It has all of these incredible contributors, like Jacques Vallée contributes, the great psychosocial theorist Martin S. Kottmeyer contributes. There's stuff by Walt Andrus, there's stuff by Kevin Randles, Bud Hopkins, who I might disagree with, but was certainly a heavy hitter, Stanton Friedman, even Eric von Daniken, Whitley Strieber. I think John Keel even wrote some stuff in there. The late, great, and skeptical Carl Sagan. So it's a book just filled with all kinds of fascinating overviews of various topics in the UFO field, the same way if you read a classic encyclopedia like the Encyclopedia Britannica, it would have entries written by people who were experts in that field. This encyclopedia is very much the same. So I'll put it on screen once again. I think you can probably pick it up secondhand pretty affordably. I think it's long since out of print, but the Encyclopedia of Extraterrestrial Encounters, it's absolutely just fantastic. I can't imagine anybody who had any kind of interest in the UFO field not finding something of value in that series. And now I'm going to pop up 2 books I've only recently read. You might remember on Mysterious Library a couple of months ago, Jason and I did an episode on the Shaver mystery. For those who didn't watch that episode, or for those of you who don't know what the Shaver mystery is, the Shaver mystery originated in the mid 1940s and continued in its popularity through about 1948. It's based on the one of the authors, his name was Richard Shaver, and he was a welder who began to claim that his welding equipment, he was picking up voices. He could hear voices. At first, he thought it was his fellow workers, and then he thought it was these evil, underground, alien-type beings who were interfering constantly with humanity with this advanced technology that they had. Now, how his story became so significant and so famous was began to send letters to Amazing Stories. Amazing Stories was the preeminent science fiction pulp magazine of the day. Its circulation was, I think, close to double any other science fiction pulp magazine, and it achieved that success by the editor of the time, Ray Palmer. Ray Palmer had kind of delivered what so many readers wanted in the science fiction world, which was high adventure. I think he himself called it like Western or cowboy science fiction, like, lots of, Buck Rogers-y style fights and adventures and the like, as well as a growing kind of undercurrent of esotericism and potential real life stories of the strange. So the Shaver mystery was run in Amazing Stories as science fiction, and Ray Palmer at least ghost wrote those original Shaver stories that got sent through and made them super exciting high fantasy science fiction, but always with the caveat that it was based on truth. Now, the fascinating thing is when they began to run these stories, Amazing Stories was flooded with letters from other readers who said, "I've also been to the caves where these things live," or "These things have also been interfering with me." And Richard Shaver himself, the author, or at least the person who I think eventually he wrote more of them himself, but originally I think Ray Palmer was very much involved in shaping the stories. Richard Shaver said he'd spent 8 years in the caverns living with what he called the Teros. The Teros were the good creatures that lived beneath the earth, and the Deros were the bad ones that lived beneath the earth, and they were kind of always battling with the Deros, the bad ones often getting the upper hand to terrorize and kidnap humans and make everything terrible for the surface dwellers. Now, the two books that deal with this story just fantastically, and I can't recommend them enough. I've only read them recently. Again, they came out after my time doing my PhD dissertation because I wrote about Shaver and Palmer in my PhD, but there was nothing of this level of just coverage of it, and that is War Over Lemuria, Richard Shaver, Ray Palmer, and the strangest chapter of 1940 science fiction, as well as the companion piece Shaverology. They're both by Richard Toronto, who's the premier biographer and researcher in this material. And I thought I knew a fair amount about the Shaver mystery. Again, I'd written about it at PhD level. I think I got my hands on a lot of the stuff that was available then, but I knew very little. And when I read this book, I realized how little I actually knew. For example, the traditional story is the hardcore science fiction fans, not the hundreds of thousands of readers who loved it, but the handful of really hardcore science fiction fans, maybe 1 or 200 people, hated the Shaver mystery. Ray Palmer ran his publishing empire. What the publishing company didn't belong to him, but he was the editor of a number of science fiction and other genre magazines out of Chicago. And the Chicago kind of crowd were all apple pie American. They wanted the type of action sci-fi I was writing about or talking about before. But in New York, there was a very different crowd. They thought science fiction should always be cerebral and should be based on real science, and it shouldn't be too fantastic and over the top and crazy. Their politics were also very much to the left, while Shaver was, again, very much traditional Americana in those days, which is what we would consider the right, I guess, today. And long before the Shaver mystery, which is what I always thought had encouraged the ire of the science fiction fans, who eventually got the Shaver mystery cancelled, incidentally. Cancel culture existed even then, apparently. They hated Palmer. I never knew this long before the Shaver mystery. They hated Palmer for the all-American, gung-ho content he was putting out with, over the top type science fiction stories for years before. And the Shaver mystery just was the final, I suppose, thorn in their craw, and it made them do this aggressive campaign, just emailing the publishers and, having article after article in fanzine about how horrible Ray Palmer was and how the Shaver mystery was, damaging to people's mental health. And sure enough, eventually Ziff Davis, the publishing company, made Ray Palmer cancel the Shaver story. He couldn't say it was true anymore, and they kind of fobbed it off to this private side publication, the Shaver Mystery magazine, and that, though, was the beginning of the kind of end of the Shaver mystery. Now, why it's fascinating so much to me is when I became interested, again, not too long ago in this, when I first wrote about it, I lived in Sydney. I was nowhere near Wisconsin. So I knew Palmer was out of Milwaukee originally. I knew he lived here, but I hadn't thought about, it for a long time. I certainly hadn't thought about the exact location. But when I was researching the Shaver mystery and amazing stories and Ray Palmer again, the name of the town of Amherst, Wisconsin popped up. In fact, Palmer's private publishing house after he left Amazing Stories was called Amherst Press. And Richard Shaver had moved to a little place near Amherst called Lanark, I think, where he bought a farm. And then he encouraged Richard Shaver to move there. And encouraged Richard Shaver, encouraged Ray Palmer to move there as well. And Ray Palmer continued to publish magazines about flying saucers, magazines about the Shaver mystery, magazines about space travel, all kinds of things out of essentially a farm property in, I think he had a barn at one stage he published out of, and he might have bought an old schoolhouse at one stage he used to publish out of. But he published out of Amherst, Wisconsin. And Ray Palmer has, as I said in my PhD dissertation, I've agreed with this interpretation for a long time, may be the man who invented flying saucers, meaning he was the person who laid so much of the UFO lore down before UFOs burst into the scene in 1947. So in 1945 or 44, when the Shaver mystery starts, you start to already see ideas of humans being abducted, ancient spacefaring civilizations, aliens with all this advanced technology. And so when the flying saucers first appear in the sky, both Palmer and Shaver go, hey, that must be the people from, under the ground, all the other aliens we know that they communicate with. And that, of course, first came to public consciousness, flying saucers, was Kenneth Arnold, the pilot, when he saw 9 craft that moved, as he said, they skipped like saucers would if you threw them over water, the way you skip a stone or a rock on the surface of a water. That's how the flying saucers moved. He never described them as disc-like. In fact, they were more like bat wing shaped or delta wing shaped in the tale told by Kenneth Arnold, the original witness. But headline writers got a hold of him describing them like saucers would if you skip them across water, and changed the movement of the craft into the shape of the craft, hence flying saucers. The fascinating thing is that, and this is a long story and I won't tell the whole story, but essentially Ray Palmer employed Kenneth Arnold after he became famous as the first flying saucer witness to go and investigate another UFO sighting or a UFO crash, again, which was meant to have taken place before Roswell, but not reported until afterwards. And that's the Maury Island incident. And out of that case, so much of modern UFO lore came as well. UFO crashes, government conspiracies that kill people, abductions, missing time, men in black. You all see that in their book, The Coming of the Saucers, in some of the articles they wrote earlier about it as well. So Palmer essentially was one of the first people who to beat the extraterrestrial or the strange, these things aren't human drum, when most of America was still thinking it was advanced Russian technology or advanced American technology or just misidentifications of celestial bodies. Ray Palmer was saying, no, this is something to do with the Shaver mystery, or this is something to do with extraterrestrials. Or so he really was, back in the day, the first perhaps major popularizer of it. And a lot of people, including John Keel, including the arch skeptic Donald Menzel, including another skeptic, Martin Gardner, including people like Richard Toronto, have all pointed out to the fact that Palmer was seriously involved in the growth of UFO belief. A lot of UFO people, or at least people who believe that UFOs are extraterrestrial, don't like to talk about Ray Palmer. In many ways, he's been written out of some of the more popular UFO histories. For example, David Jacobs, who, when I did my PhD dissertation on the history of UFO belief, had previously written probably the most important history of UFO belief, the UFO controversy in America. Palmer, I think, is mentioned once in a footnote in that book. He's essentially a non-entity in it, but he was at the very beginning the most important person in the development of UFO belief. So again, it is definitely worth reading War Over Lemuria and Shaverology. And what's fascinating for me is I was getting to Amherst. When I Googled Amherst, much to my surprise, because I'd always thought Palmer was so important to something I've spent a lot of my time studying, UFO belief, Amherst is literally down the road from me. Like, it's I don't know, it's less than a 50-minute drive to where Ray Palmer's farm was, where he published things. In fact, it's such a small world. I've recently met this lovely woman who grew up near Amherst. I wasn't trying to meet somebody from Amherst. I just met her and she was, "Yeah, I'm from grew up in the Amherst area." So that's how close I am to the Ray Palmer connection, I guess. So it just fascinates me that by this total weird twist of fate, and this is a bit of a personal rant now, myself had been interested in flying saucers, and it had been an incredible part of my life studying it, I suppose, and now talking about it again. I am in literally where Ray Palmer published most of his stuff out of, and it's also where Richard Shaver, for those of you who are interested in Richard Shaver, he, after the Shaver mystery, started to dig rocks out of the ground and split them and do this kind of process where he saw what he thought was ancient books written in stone by the ancient advanced kind of, they weren't extraterrestrial, they were from here, although a lot of them left and went to space. But these advanced beings who lived before us, it very much kind of predates Eric von Daniken's ancient astronaut theory. Anyway, Shaver's rock art became quite famous in recent times. Shaver's long since passed. Both Shaver and Palmer died within a couple of years of each other in the mid-70s. But his art became kind of recognized as a significant outsider art. And Richard Shaver's art was displayed in galleries, top galleries in New York City and Los Angeles. Anyway, it's outside of Amherst in his farm in Lanark, which is where Shaver, I think his wife at the time, first started digging what they thought was strange rock artifacts out of the ground. I think one story says people were planting potatoes and they found the rocks that had been dug out and they thought they were these ancient relics. So to now find myself so close to ground zero to so much of this belief, it was kind of staggering to me. I'm still kind of reeling from it just a little bit. Now, before I disappear, I'm so sorry, I haven't been in the chat because I'm driving without Jason tonight, so I just should say hello to all you lovely folks. Thank you so much, Joe Fox, for watching tonight, and as you always do, we really appreciate you. I hope you had a Merry Christmas and have a wonderful New Year. Mothman46 is another regular viewer. Thank you so much for being here again, Mothman46. Other people have made a number of comments. We see Emily Men's House from What the Frick Live, who very kindly is co-hosting Talking Weird with me this Saturday night, the New Year's Eve episode, so we can chat about the strange year that was and various, important stories about UFOs and other things. Ed Schultz, who's a frequent guest of the show, has commented as well. Ken Rock also, thank you so much for being with us. Thank you to everybody who's been a part of the show this year. There's more as well, but I'll be scrolling through and dealing with it too long, and it's difficult to do when I'm driving alone. I hope that everybody has a safe and prosperous new year. If there's books you want to see us do on the show, drop something in the comments. You don't have to do it live. You can do it on the YouTube afterwards or on the Facebook afterwards. If you want us to read a message from you on the show, if there's something you disagree with and you want to have your say, or maybe you want to report something strange, you can go to untoldradioam.com, just the homepage, and you can scroll down a little ways and you'll see where you can leave a voice message, and you just have to say what show you want to have it read on the network. Maybe you want to read it on another show. Maybe you have a Bigfoot encounter and you'd rather have it read on one of the Bigfoot shows, or maybe you have something you think would be more fitting for Weird Encounters or for Talking Weird. But you should leave a message. Of course, it's also worth leaving something for Untold Radio AM, the flagship show with Doug Hychek and Alex Hychek. I know they love getting people's voice messages. So again, thank you so much, everybody, for joining me. Your prayers go out to Jason, so he'll get better soon. I know it's been a tough Christmas for some. It's been cold and brutal. I know a good friend of the show had plumbing problems. His pipes froze. I know another good friend of the show had to cancel his family Christmas. I know people have been snowed in and yada yada yada. It's been a tough time. I hope it gets easier for everybody very, very shortly. And again, I hope to, see you continue to contribute to the show. We love to hear your feedback and your opinions. And until we see you next week, keep it weird.